series that's from the last few months. So really, I just wanted to thank you, Judy, for hosting this series. I've enjoyed all the lectures that I've certainly attended. It's been a great opportunity, I think, to showcase the quality of the work that's going on over at Bar Ilan. And as I said, over the last few weeks, we are planning to do more Bar Ilan events in the UK. So do sign up to our mailing list, go onto our website, British Friends of Bar Ilan, and hopefully we'll see you at more Bar Ilan events over the coming months and years. But thanks.
Oh, sorry, I did that too soon.
But thank you again, Judy, and looking forward to the last lecture today. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. It's really been so nice having you join each week, and to have the Bar Ilan British friends join us as through you, which is great. So yes, as Max said, it's the finale, and I'm not sure whether it's really good or just nice that Toby, who is British and has I think been to JW3, then not for me. We're delighted to have you as our finale and knowing how good you are. Although having said that, every single one of these lectures has been amazing. So again, our gratitude to Bar Ilan for bringing the series to us and for allowing this to happen. Part of me is kind of sorry that we didn't do this during lockdown when we had people from all over the world, and who are now, of course, going all over the world and traveling. And but it's so lovely, and the fact that we've recorded them, so people who can't be with us today, there are quite a few who are traveling and will watch it later. So Toby, I don't want to take any more of your time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you, Max. Thank you to JW3. I've visited events at JW3. I've not had the opportunity until now to address or speak to JW3, but I hope this won't be the last time. And yeah, it's an honor for me to follow on from my Bar Ilan colleagues. I'm glad you've heard from some. We have got a great group of colleagues in the department at Bar Ilan, and I'm glad you've had the opportunity to hear from some of them. And I hope I will keep the high standard up. And thank you all very much for joining the event. So as you know, the topic of my lecture, my presentation, is Israel's future in a world of civilizational identities. Before I launch into my kind of presentation, I always prefer, if I can, to start with a kind of interactive element here. So I'd like to throw out a question to the audience, and it's kind of two questions actually, and they're sort of yes/no questions. So you can vote. You can either, if you're familiar with the kind of thumbs up tool in Zoom, you can use that, or if not, you can just physically put up your thumb or wave for which option you want to choose. So two questions. The first question is Britain part of the West? A yes/no question. So if you think Britain is part of the West, put up a thumb or a digital thumb or a virtual thumb, or raise a hand now. Okay, thank you. And if you think Britain is not part of the West, then raise a hand or a thumb or somewhere indicate now. Okay, so a pretty strong consensus there, and I think I agree with the consensus in the group. All right, so a second question. Israel. Is Israel part of the West? If you think Israel is part of the West, then put up a thumb, raise a hand, or indicate somehow. And if you think Israel is not part of the West, or if you think somehow maybe that's a problematic, or you're not so sure about that claim, you have doubts about that claim, put up a thumb, raise a hand, okay, so a few kind of I've seen these kinds of responses. Okay, so I'm not going to launch into a big discussion, but I maybe just would invite okay, there was quite a strong consensus on the UK side. Obviously, Israel, there was a less strong consensus, a bit more doubt about it. Maybe somebody who, just in one sentence, somebody who felt, responded that Israel is part of the West. Could maybe just give us one sentence sort of defending that claim or explaining why they think Israel is part of the West? Anybody, just literally in one sentence, any kind of argument for that? I see Marianne's hand. Oh, or somebody else. Yeah, Victor, maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think democracy is a major part of it.
Okay, excellent. So democracy, as well as democracy, the West stands for democracy. Okay, that's a pretty solid claim. Anyone more? I'll take one more in favor that Israel is part of the West, very briefly, if anyone wants to. Okay, so somebody that threw some doubt on that question, want to say why they're less sure that Israel is part of the West? Anybody that kind of gave this or was a bit unsure? Go on, Jacqueline. I see your hand.
Israel is part of the West from the political point of view, but from a strategic point of view, it's definitely in the Middle East, an Asian country. And the population is probably becoming increasingly Middle Eastern as we go through the years, in attitudes, in development, in the approach they have to the rest of the area where they live. And they actually have to become like that. Otherwise, the countries around them will say, oh, it's a Western implant. It's a Western implant, but it's not. It's people who have lived in that region, Jewish people who've lived in that region for centuries, are disregarded by these people who go on and say it's a Western implant.
Okay, all right. So you've already said 4 or 5 things there, which are really interesting and really relevant. So thank you for that. So one is the kind of, maybe there's a distinction between its politics and its strategic, or maybe I would say geostrategic position. You're not talking about its alliances, you're talking about where it sits geographically. And I understood. And but you also mentioned the cultural aspect there, right? So there's a question of the cultural identity of the population. And then you drew a connection between that and Israel's relations with its neighbors, right? Is Israel seen as some kind of Western implant in the Middle East? Doesn't really belong there? Or is it accepted as part of the region? You suggested that maybe there's an evolution in the cultural identity of the population. It's becoming more Middle Eastern, and you actually said that's a positive thing in terms of Israel being accepted in the region. Okay. All right, so that's great. So we've already thrown out some really interesting ideas there, some of which I hope we're going to follow up on and touch on, and maybe expound on over the course of the talk. So what I'm talking about today is what it means to identify with different cultural or civilizational identities like the West that cross national borders, that are transnational. So identities that don't just relate to one state, but that can cross the borders and relate to populations in different states. I'm going to talk about some trends in transnational identity politics, so these kinds of identities and their significance politically. And I'm going to try and connect that to some trends in Israeli politics and what it means for Israel's place in the world. But before I talk about Israel, I want to talk a bit about civilizations in world politics and sort of what I mean by that and what I don't mean by that. So if I asked you all to name one book about civilizations in international politics, there might be one in particular. There's a particularly famous one that you might have heard of. So anybody want to throw out the name of a book that relates to civilizations in international politics? You can name another, and maybe not the one I'm thinking of, but I'm guessing or anticipating you might think of one in particular. All right. It's one of those unfair. Oh yeah, go ahead, Marianne. Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a book, but there was a television series, an extensive one, I think from the 70s or 80s, called Civilization, which was very Western centric.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's one of these annoying questions that the lecturer throws out sometimes. It's not good educational practice when the lecturer throws out an answer where they already have the answer in their head and they're waiting for the student to guess the right answer. It's probably not very good teaching practice. But anyway, I'll tell you. I'll show you what I was thinking of. So I'm sharing my screen now, and I hope you can all see it. So the book that I have in my mind is you can see. Can you see my screen? Is that coming up?
Yes, it's fine, Toby.
Okay, great. Okay, so the book I'm had in mind is this famous book. Well, it was originally an academic paper by a famous American political scientist called Samuel Huntington, called The Clash of Civilizations, and then a book that he published in 1996 by the same name. And some of you may have heard this phrase or heard of this book, The Clash of Civilizations. It had a big impact among the general public, maybe less so among scholars of international relations who were not very keen on it, but nonetheless, it had a lot of readers, and it continues to be quite influential in certain quarters. So Huntington's big argument in this book, he was writing at the end of the Cold War. The Cold War had ended, and he asked himself the question, as many political scientists were asking and scholars of international relations were asking, what will be the big forces, the big ideas, the big themes that will shape international politics or international order after the Cold War? So if during the Cold War, we had these two big blocks, essentially we had a divide in the world between two big Western ideologies: capitalism, associated with liberal democracy in the West, led by the US and NATO and others, and against another Western ideology, which is communism. And that was the kind of big clash that shaped a lot of what happened in international politics. So Huntington's response was that rather than this clash between two Western ideologies, we'd actually see the emergence of non-Western regions and values, and we'd have a world of multiple civilizations. And the main tensions in the world would be between states of different cultural or civilizational identity. So he wrote, nation states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. So civilization for Huntington is the largest category of shared culture that we can speak about. And it can go beyond one state or even one linguistic group and encompass a group or a constellation of states and populations across different states. And often these civilizations have a religion at their core. And Huntington argued in particular that there was a kind of, and this was one of the more famous elements of the thesis, that there was an inevitable clash between the West and the Islamic world. So there were some problems with this thesis. One of the problems was it turned out to be not correct. But I'm being a bit unfair. If I'm being more generous, I would say that Huntington was partly right and partly wrong. So he was right, I think, to identify, and very prescient, to identify that we live in a world of multiple civilizations. So the idea, which was also very prevalent around the time that Huntington wrote this book, that we're all countries and all societies are on a kind of one-way track to liberal democracy and free market capitalist economics. That was an idea associated in particular with a political scientist called Francis Fukuyama, who talked about something called the end of history. That idea, that's not the world we're living in. That has not really come to pass. There has been a big expansion of freedom and democracy in many parts of the world, but we don't seem to be on a track, at least not in any time soon, to the universal spread of liberal democracy and capitalist economics as the system for running societies. So Huntington was right. That's not the kind of world we're living in. We have multiple different versions of value systems and cultural identities that shape how societies are run. And I think he was also right that identities, that civilizational identities, identifying with one of these big cultural blocks, can be very powerful in motivating or in justifying political choices. But Huntington, I think, was wrong, and others that share my approach to this kind of issue, he was wrong to think that civilizations are very fixed in their essence, and that civilizations are internally unified or coherent in their identity. And he was wrong to think that clashes between civilizations or states of different civilizations were more important in understanding world politics than clashes within civilizations and even within countries to define their identities. And even some political scientists, including one of my colleagues at Bar Ilan, Professor Jonathan Fox, did kind of research where they count conflicts in the world and measure their intensity. And he found that if you count conflicts and measure their intensity, that conflicts between states of different civilizations are not more frequent or more intense than conflicts between states of overlapping or similar civilization or culture. So what I'm interested in, and what other researchers who share my interest are interested in, is not, for example, whether Islam and the West are destined to clash, but rather how are politicians and other actors within states that have those identities trying or competing to fix a particular version of what those identities stand for. Because within any civilization, we have a whole complex mess of different ideas about what the authentic cultural values of that society or that state or that civilization ought to be. And I want to try and illustrate what I'm talking about with a couple of examples. So first of all, the kind of bit that reflects kind of favorably on Huntington's thesis, which is we do see leaders of especially non-Western states asserting or affirming civilizational identity as a way of resisting Western, or what we might call Western ideas, or what they would call perhaps Western ideas of universal, or what people in the West might call universal values of human rights and liberalism. So just to show you an example here. Again, I'm just going to share my screen. So there was a summit just over a year ago between the leaders of two very important states, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And they had a summit. This was just before Russia invaded Ukraine. And in which they had this summit in which they declared their mutual friendship and support. And they issued a statement, and you can find it in English on the website of the Kremlin, for example. And among other things, it said, the sides, which means China and Russia, call on the international community to respect cultural diversity and the rights of people of different countries to self-determination. They stand ready to work together with all the interested partners to promote genuine democracy. So what are they saying here? I think what they're trying to say here is, we don't accept Western countries trying to impose their value systems and their ways of running things and their ideas about how the world should be run on us. We have our own standards. We have our own set of values. They're rooted in our own civilizations. So they have authenticity and legitimacy of our civilizations that go back hundreds of thousands of years. We live in a world of multiple civilizations, multiple different kind of value systems. And, you know, we have our own idea of what democracy is, right? And it's just as legitimate as your idea. So don't tell us how to behave, how to treat our populations, what kind of standards to how to relate to other countries. We have our own authentic standards, and other countries around the world might be attracted to our values and not rather than being attracted to your values. Okay, so that's an illustration of something I think that Huntington kind of was pressing about, a world of kind of different value systems. But to illustrate the other bit where we have within civilizations internal contestation or pluralism or competition to define what the values of the civilization really stand for, rather than it really coherent or unified civilizational blocks, which I don't think we have. I just illustrate that. I mean, I could give many examples from many different parts of the world, but let's just think about one famous one. Can anybody identify who this is on the screen?
Malala Yousafzai.
Right. What and can you, in a sentence, who is Malala and what's she famous for?
He was shot by the Taliban
In Pakistan.
Yes.
That's right.
She recovered. Her father brought her here to hospital here, and she recovered and works tirelessly now, although now married, for girls' education, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and, well, the world.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So Malala, shot by the Taliban in Pakistan, she even as a child was known for promoting the rights of girls to receive an education. Okay. Why do I present a picture of Malala? It's an illustration of an internal clash within a society to try and define what the values of that society stand for or mean, right? And none of us can say what it means to be authentically Muslim or Pakistani or Afghan, right? That's an internal struggle taking place within that society, right? Illustrated by this brutal shooting of this girl for campaigning for the rights of women to education. I'm sure many of you will have heard on the media the voices of Afghan women in despair that since the return of the Taliban, their rights to education, which they had fought for and gained during the period of occupation of the US and other NATO powers, has now been reversed with the return of the Taliban. So we live in a world of multiple civilizations, but those civilizations are not internally unified or coherent. There are struggles within them to define their values. Okay. And we also see this kind of struggle within Western states to define Western values, right? And I can illustrate that with some pictures of political leaders that you will no doubt know. I'm sure you'll all recognize in the image above there, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And in the image below, can anyone identify the individuals in the image below?
Marine Le Pen and Macron.
Absolutely right. So you have the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and his rival for the presidency of France over the last 2 presidential elections in France, Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen, of course, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, a famous or infamous French far-right politician, the founder and leader of the Front National. Marine Le Pen now leads the party. It's now under a different name. It's called Rassemblement National, and it's somewhat moderated, but it's still very much a radical right political party. So, you know, Biden and Trump and Le Pen and Macron representing internal divides, deep divides within Western states to try and define what does our society, what are the values that our society really stands for in both Europe and in the United States. We have, you know, this kind of former, let's say, liberal consensus represented by the EU, by mainstream centrist politicians that say European values are democracy, rule of law, humanitarian values, and these are universal values. They don't just apply to one culture. And they're tolerant of different cultures that can coexist within a single liberal society. And there's an alternative on the radical right that says Western values are the values of a particular cultural heritage. Sometimes it might be called Christian, sometimes Judeo-Christian, or it might be related to the kind of classical heritage. And from the perspective of this radical right alternative, the authentic culture of the West is threatened by non-white cultures, especially in the European context, especially Islam. The US context is overlapping, but slightly different. So we have in the US and Europe an assertion of a kind of ultra-conservative nationalism which treats native or majority cultures as threatened by many processes, but especially migration. Okay, so we have this world of multiple civilizations, but also internally contested civilizations. Let's start to think about what this means for Israel and for Jews more broadly. So first of all, something interesting to notice about the radical right, particularly the radical right in Europe, which is where I've done more of my own research, is in the last 20 years, we see a shift in the radical right in Europe from anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to philo-Semitism and pro-Zionism. We've seen, and as an illustration of this, in many radical right parties in Europe. Also, we see this somewhat in the US in a slightly different way. The phrase Judeo-Christian has become interchangeable with Christian for a wide swathe of radical right parties to refer to the authentic cultural roots of Europe. And why this phrase Judeo-Christian? I think, okay, well, first of all, I'll just illustrate it with a very striking example. So I don't know if anybody recognizes the individual here visiting Yad Vashem a few years ago. This is a slightly tougher one. The gentleman in the hat.
Is that Orban?
It's not Orban. but it's not a bad guess. It's another radical right populist nationalist European politician. Okay, it's the former Vice Chancellor of Austria, Hans Christian Strache. And when he visited Yad Vashem, firstly, a few words about Strache. Strache was a neo-Nazi in his youth, before sort of moderating and becoming, entering kind of democratic and parliamentary politics. He became the leader of the radical right party in Austria, which is the party that was founded by ex-Nazi officers in the 1950s. It's still a very important political party in Austrian politics. It's called the Austrian Freedom Party. He was the leader of the party, and he said something where you see him visiting Yad Vashem, which is also a clue as to the way that he sought to change the direction of his party. And what did he say at Yad Vashem? He said, "I always say, if one defines the Judeo-Christian West, then Israel represents a kind of border. If Israel fails, Europe fails, and if Europe fails, Israel fails." So what is the meaning of this striking statement from a politician with kind of far-right neo-Nazi roots? The Judeo-Christian West, Israel as a border. What's he trying to do here? So the message, it seems to be, is to draw Israel and Jews into the authentic cultural boundaries of Europe, right? And I think that serves two purposes for the radical right in Europe. First of all, it emphasizes that the other from the European perspective, those who are outside of the authentic cultural boundaries of Europe, those who don't really belong in Europe, are not the Jews, which is what the far right would have said in the past. The Jews are the threat to the ethnic or cultural character of Europe. Rather, who is on the outside now? Who is the threat? Not Jews today, it's Muslims. So if you frame Europe as being Judeo-Christian or the West as being Judeo-Christian, from the perspective of the radical right, it's a useful way to kind of underline the authentic Europe excludes Muslims, right? In European politics today, being anti-Jewish is toxic still. It doesn't win you votes really. But being anti-Muslim, or saying that you're standing up against the threat of Islam or radical Islam, that's politically powerful in a context of very large Muslim minorities with small extremist elements that pose a security threat to Europe, and in the wave of uncontrolled waves of migration coming from the Middle East, and the context of radical anti-Western politics in the Islamic world. So being anti-Muslim is a more powerful political ticket for the radical right in Europe than being anti-Jewish. So not only do they position themselves as being anti-Muslim, but also they position themselves as being the defenders of Jews and authentic European values against the real anti-Semites of today, who are the radical left, they would argue, and Muslims. So they frame or redraw the boundaries of cultural Europe to include Jews, whereas before the radical right or the far right would have said that Jews were outside and not acceptable, and to include Israel also, which was also, there was a lot of anti-Zionism on the radical right in the past, Israel being seen as associated with the United States, which is seen negatively. So it's an illustration of how political leaders try to redefine or reshape the cultural boundaries of their state or of their region according to their political agenda. And we actually seen these kinds of conservative or populist nationalist, ultra-conservative or populist nationalist politicians showing a lot of diplomatic support for Israel. So that creates in itself a kind of dilemma for Israel. How should Israel respond to that kind of dilemma? And I think we see to that kind of outreach or diplomatic support or expressions of friendship coming from the European radical right or in the United States, similarly, if you think of Trump. So I think we see two different trends in Israel. And I think we see two different trends in Israel because we see a fundamental divide inside Israel about what Israel stands for, between those represented by the current Israeli coalition who want to raise the Jewish character of the state and what they think of as the Jewish character, which means the Orthodox Jewish character of the state, above the liberal and democratic character of the state, and those more generally in the opposition who want to hold in balance the two, the Jewish character and the liberal democratic character. And I think the current intense debate in Israel today about the legal system is in significant part about the ability of the Orthodox and the right to shape the state according to their conservative, religious, or ultra-nationalist values, and in opposition to liberal humanist values, without, judges getting in the way to try and defend liberal humanist values. And this divide about what Israel should stand for shapes responses or approaches to the Palestinian question. Should Israel prioritize holding on to all of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel? Or should it prioritize its future as a Jewish and democratic state by giving up territory and allowing for the creation of a Palestinian state and allowing for the realization of Palestinian rights alongside the state of Israel, and also recognizing, the rights of non-Jews inside the state of Israel? I think this divide within Israel shapes attitudes towards the Jewish diaspora, in particular non-Orthodox Jews, and it shapes attitudes also towards global politics and how to position Israel in this emerging kind of multipolar, multi-civilizational world. So to illustrate that, here you see some examples of the approach of the current Prime Minister, Netanyahu, speaking to different audiences. So here you see in the upper quotation there, this is Netanyahu speaking to Christians United for Israel annual conference. That's a group of kind of American Christian, pro-Israel Christian group, including kind of Christian evangelicals. And he said in a speech to that audience, it's a struggle of civilizations. It's a struggle of free societies against the forces of militant Islam. They hate Israel because of the West, because we represent a free society built on the foundation of Judeo-Christian heritage. So very much engaging in that kind of language. And the lower quotation is a speech that he made. It wasn't actually a speech. It was a remark caught on microphone when he was speaking in theory privately with a group of European leaders from the Visegrad group of countries. The Visegrad group of countries is countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It's Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And he said in a conversation with the leaders of those countries, we are part of the European culture. Europe ends in Israel. East of Israel, there is no more Europe. We have no greater friends than the Christians who support Israel around the world. So we see Netanyahu, of course, in his domestic politics, has positioned himself increasingly as the defender of Israel's ethnic Jewish character against domestic and international threats. And when seeking to win favor with Christian, conservative, and populist nationalist audiences in the West, he'll talk about Israel as being Europe's or the Judeo-Christian West's front line against radical Islam. So why does he do that? I think for Netanyahu, in my interpretation, a strong international ethos of human rights, of liberalism, even liberal democracy, is actually something of a threat. It drives Western states to put pressure on him and his governments over Palestinian rights, and put pressure on his government currently over his government's attacks on liberal democratic institutions in Israel. And just recently, he's been visiting European capitals. He went to Berlin, to Paris, also to London, and he went away with a flea in his ear from Macron in France, from Schulz in Germany, even a bit from Rishi Sunak in the UK, who said, we don't like this erosion of liberal democracy in Israel. And President Biden, the president of the United States, won't even have Netanyahu over to the White House. He said so publicly. I said, I'm not having him here, basically. This is a major problem for Israel. It's a problem for Netanyahu politically and personally, but it's also a problem for Israel strategically, because in particular, the relationship with the United States, Israel needs high-level summits with the US right now. It has major, pressing, urgent national security issues. I'm thinking in particular of the Iranian nuclear program that requires high-level meetings between Netanyahu and Biden doesn't want to have Netanyahu over. So by contrast, leaders like Trump, former President Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, they don't really care about promoting universal human rights. And in fact, they'd also like to undermine this idea of a liberal international order that stands for human rights and humanitarian values, which they consider a threat to their own politics and agendas. So they're useful allies for Netanyahu. So Netanyahu does not see Israel as naturally embedded in a kind of liberal internationalist West in that sense. But I think there's a significant gap between that approach and the approach of some of the politicians currently in the Israeli opposition. So if we can contrast this, for example, with Yair Lapid, former Israeli prime minister for a short period, and before that he was Israeli foreign minister when he was the alternate prime minister in the weird government that Israel had before the current one. So Lapid, as foreign minister, on his first day in the job as foreign minister, this was exactly 2 years ago, June 2021, made a speech to the diplomats in the foreign ministry, the Israeli foreign ministry, to tell them this is going to be my agenda. And he said, the outgoing government took a terrible gamble to focus exclusively on the Republican Party and abandon Israel's bipartisan standing in the US. The same is true with the Jewish world. The support of Christian evangelicals and other groups is important and heartwarming, but the Jewish people are more than allies. Jews from all streams, Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox, are our family. Also, with the countries of the European Union, our relationship with too many governments has been neglected and become hostile. And you see him in a picture there, sort of, clasping hands with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And he made a big effort to go out and build bridges with politicians that are more associated with the kind of liberal mainstream in Europe, and of course the United States, where a liberal mainstream centrist politician, Biden, had become president. But I don't think it's just a different perspective on Israel's strategic interests. I think it also reflects different values. Lapid represents the Israeli centre or centre-left that values the liberal democratic character of the state of Israel highly alongside the Jewish character. And he has a pro-two-state vision with respect to the Palestinians, which is aligned with the international liberal consensus. So he does not consider liberal internationalism really to be threatening, as Netanyahu does. Rather, he sees the Western liberal camp, mainstream centrist politicians in the US and Germany and France and the UK, as Israel's natural strategic allies and partners, just as they were during the Cold War and for much of the period since then. So a divide in Israel about its own identity and implications for how it relates to other states and leaders in the world, and how it relates to this identity clash in different parts of the world. Okay. So we've talked a bit about Israel in the West. I want to talk about Israel a little bit in the Middle East. So given that quotation that I just mentioned from Netanyahu, our friends are the Christians against militant Islam, it might seem a bit paradoxical when we think about the Abraham Accords. Right? So as you know, in September 2020, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain agreed to normalize relations with Israel. Later, they were followed by Morocco. And it's not so hard to explain their motivations for that. We can think about the strategic issues in the region, the threat of Iran, the US appearing to lose interest in the region. So a desire to build closer strategic relations with Israel in terms of their own defense and security for these Gulf Arab states, also a desire to diversify their economies. So we can understand their motivations. But it's interesting that in the language around the Abraham Accords, there was kind of a cultural language or civilizational language that surrounded these accords. I want to give you an example here. So here's a quotation from the peace treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. There's a sentence in there which doesn't appear in any other Arab-Israeli peace agreement, and that we've seen historically. There's also no similar sentence in the Israel-Bahrain agreement, but the Israel-UAE agreement has this remarkable sentence. It says, recognizing that the Arab and Jewish peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and inspired in that spirit to foster in the Middle East a reality in which Muslims, Jews, Christians, and peoples of all faiths, denominations, beliefs, and nationalities live in, and are committed to a spirit of coexistence, mutual understanding, and mutual respect. So this seems to be a quite remarkable sentence, and it says Jews and Arabs are descendants of a common ancestor. So if you put that alongside that, the sorts of things that Netanyahu is saying to Western audiences, that we are part of the Judeo-Christian West, and we are part of your, we are your front line against militant Islam. And here he's saying we Jews and Arabs are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham. right? It seems kind of paradoxical. I think we can solve that paradox in a couple of different ways. And I'll try to explain that in a moment. But first of all, just want to think about this remarkable sentence from the Emirati perspective. The source of this sentence, it's an interesting story. It relates to the agenda of some officials in the US, some officials in Israel, some officials in the Emirates. But I want to think about the Emirates for a minute here. Why are the UAE interested in promoting or in going along with this kind of language, not only of, okay, a secular peace between two states, that's one thing, but this idea about Jews and Arabs as descendants of a common ancestor, this idea that Jacqueline mentioned earlier, about about Israel or Jews being a legitimate part of the region, not just kind of Western implants. Why is the UAE interested in going along with this kind of agenda? And it's not just one sentence in the Israel-UAE peace accord, which doesn't exist in any other Arab-Israeli peace accord. We see it also in other kinds of projects that the UAE is involved with. Can anybody identify these buildings? I'll give you a clue. They are in Abu Dhabi. Okay, so what you see in this upper picture here is something called the Abrahamic Family House. The Abrahamic Family House is a monumental mosque, church, and synagogue that has been constructed on one site in Abu Dhabi. The UAE announced it was going to build this project in September 2019, a year before it signed its peace agreement with Israel. And it was opened just a few months ago. In fact, Rabbi Mervis was there at the opening, and I believe put the mezuzah on the synagogue. So, and it was actually designed by a British architect, who I believe has spoken at JW3, David Adjei. So what is the motivation of the UAE and Abu Dhabi to build this kind of monumental synagogue next to a mosque and church, even before signing a peace agreement with Israel? So I've been doing some research on this. I think there's two main motivations. One relates to a message that they're trying to send locally to their own population and within the region, within the Middle East. And that is about a need that they understand, the leadership understand, to change attitudes and narratives about Jews in the Middle East and legitimize normalization of relations with Israel, which I think, they anticipated that normalization was coming down the line, even if it hadn't happened yet. And also they want to, within the region, within the Middle East, legitimize good relations with the West, which of course are strategically very, very important for the UAE. And they want to give legitimacy to that in religious and cultural terms and challenge the narratives of others like the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist extremists who, think that the relationship with the West is kind of toxic to Islam. So it's a message locally, but it's also a message, I think, part of a message to the West, which is about seeking legitimacy and acceptance in the West or promoting a version of cultural harmony or commonality or overlap or constructive exchange that is not based on a shared overlapping set of values related to liberal democracy. The UAE is not a liberal democracy. It's not going to become a liberal democracy. And it needs to fend off lots of accusations about human rights abuses and that kind of thing. So they're looking to promote a sense of shared identity with the West that's based on other stuff, not based on shared liberal democratic values. And I think you can see that if you look at where the Abrahamic Family House sits geographically in the Abu Dhabi Cultural District, which I have not myself visited, but I'm hoping to do so before long. I don't know if any of you have been there, maybe some of you have. But you see the Abrahamic Family House located there, kind of in a triangle with other institutions, including the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, which is a monumental museum, obviously associated with its sister museum in Paris, original Louvre in Paris, and the Guggenheim, which is under construction, a Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, another spectacular monumental construction project. So what are these? Okay, so what is the point here? I think the point here is if you're a leader of a moderate Muslim state or leader that's seeking legitimacy in the West to underline to legitimize or cement your important strategic relations with the West and with Europe and the US. And you want to communicate cultural openness, but you have no intention really of meeting standards of or Western standards of liberal democracy. And you want to push off challenges to your human rights record. You can build your Louvre and your Guggenheim. You can even build a church, but the real litmus test, which communicates your tolerance, your openness, your cultural diversity, is to build a shul, right? Build a synagogue. It's important to be seen to be not anti-Semitic. So ironically, it's a little bit like the radical right in Europe that wants to gain legitimacy by showing it's not against Jews, it's not anti-Semitic. So similarly, these moderate Muslim leaders want legitimacy in the Western mainstream by showing we're not against Jews, we're not anti-Semitic. So that explains it a little bit from the UAE side. But coming back to Netanyahu, how do we explain it from the Netanyahu side? So on the one hand, I think you can say, well, Netanyahu will basically say anything to anybody. You know, he's a smart politician. He knows how to speak to people in the language that they'll appreciate. So he'll talk to conservative nationalists in the West and say, we're Judeo-Christians against militant Islam, and we're your front line, and we're the end of Europe. Or, you know, and he'll talk to Muslim leaders in the Arab world and say, you know, we're all descendants of Abraham. We're Jews and Arabs are descendants of a common ancestor. And he'll say whatever suits his audience. But I think at the same time, it's interesting that there isn't really a contradiction in the way I see it between saying to the radical right in US and Europe, we are frontline against Islamic radicalism, and saying to the Emiratis, we are all children of Abraham. It's a way of promoting a shared identity or set of values that is not based on liberal democracy, which Netanyahu is not very committed to, but rather based on overlapping cultural or faith-based or civilizational values. Of course, that kind of language of Abraham and the children of Abraham was a helpful part of the discourse that got the Abraham Accords going. And it was worked when you didn't have ultra-right Jewish supremacists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the Israeli government, which you do today. And because of the far-right character of the current Israeli government, the relationship with the UAE and with Bahrain, with UAE in particular, is turning much cooler than it was. And the ultra-right character of the current Israeli government is also getting in the way of normalizing relations with other Arab states, in particular Saudi Arabia. So to try and sum up and leave some time for questions, we see a trend globally in different regions of political actors asserting civilizational values, often in opposition or in resistance to a sort of idea of universal liberal values. And within these civilizational groups, and within the states that comprise them, is a deep polarization about the identity of their state in transnational terms, and competition to define what are the authentic or legitimate boundaries of the state's national identity, but also kind of transnational identity and role in the world. And we see that internal clash also within many Western states, and of course we also see it within Israel. In this context, actually, I think Israel has many assets. Israel has a very unusual cultural identity that allows it to play on kind of different fields. It can play liberal democracy. It can play Middle Eastern state. You know, half the Jews in Israel have Middle Eastern origin. 20% of the country, of its citizens, are Arab Muslims. It can also play Judeo-Christian Western. It can play these different kind of discourses, these different kind of languages. And marginal actor at the same time, without necessarily, you know, it can pick and choose. And there are marginal actors like the radical right in Europe or moderate Muslims that want to use Israel and Jews as a kind of source of legitimacy. But embracing the radical right in Europe and the US, as Netanyahu has done, in order to fend off challenges to Israel over the Palestinians or Israel's own internal politics, I think has considerable risks and costs. And we're seeing that today in the relations between Netanyahu and the Biden administration, which I think greatly reduces Israel's strategic and diplomatic options. So the extent to which Israel goes down the route of being an illiberal society, which it's currently going down, it will be increasingly dependent on illiberal allies for its international legitimacy. And that will risk its relations with the liberal mainstream camp in Western states, which has been the core of Israel's diplomatic and military support since 1948. Okay, I think maybe at that point I'll take a pause and give the opportunity for questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Toby. That was just a brilliant presentation. Who would like to go first? Marianne.
Thank you very much for a very succinct and insightful view on all this. I read recently that Netanyahu has arranged to go and see Xi Jinping very soon, and I just wondered whether you had any comments on that was addition to what you've already said about extra liberal democratic links.
Yes, I mean, we could read it as an example of exactly what I'm saying. It sparked a debate in Israel. I mean, Netanyahu will say, look, I've been to visit Xi Jinping a few times. There's nothing special about this. And, you know, China's a massively important country and I should build my diplomatic relations with him. Why not? And others would say, actually, in the context where, you know, you have a falling out with Biden and he won't have you over, that, you know, going off to visit Xi Jinping is kind of sticking a finger in the eye of the Americans, given the rather tense relations between the US and China, or the delicate relations between the, I mean, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, was also just in China meeting with Xi Jinping, but nonetheless, those relations are very delicate. So you might say it could be read as an illustration of, you know, Netanyahu communicating, I don't have to depend on you with your liberal values. There are other global players that I can build relations with and align with. And we could talk also in that context about the attitude of Netanyahu towards Putin as well, both before and after the invasion of Ukraine.
Jean.
Oh, I'm not sure if my question is off topic, because I found your presentation really fascinating, but I'm not clear how Islamism fits into this picture, because with Islamism, they're not looking to coexist with Israel, you know, the whole from the river to the sea. They're looking to completely eliminate Israel. Not in the sense of incorporating Israeli Jewish citizens into a bigger entity, but in terms of literally eliminating them. So I find hard to understand how that fits into this picture.
Okay, so that's a good question. So it fits in the sense that Islamism is one version. Let's say within the Islamic world, we have different versions of what the authentic values of Islam should be and what Islam should stand for. And the Islamist version says the West is toxic to the Islamic world. We are and a threat to the Islamic world. And in fact, in many Islamist versions, there is a plot in the West to destroy Islam or weaken Islam. Israel is part of that, part of a Zionist Crusader alliance, they might sometimes say, and absolutely Israel must be eliminated. And it's part of this kind of Western civilizational challenge to Islam, right? So so the Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of Abu Dhabi, is trying to challenge that perspective directly, because that perspective is a threat to him and his country, which depends on its relations with the West for its security and for its economy. So it's part of that internal struggle within the Islamic world to define what are the authentic values of Islam and what does it stand for.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take Jacqueline and then David and then Victor. And Jean. Right, Jacqueline, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I've done that. The elephant in the room seems to be, or maybe there are two elephants. The elephant in the room seems to be the Palestinian issue. And also the issue of Iran. Saudi Arabia and now Syria have started relations with Iran. And this places Israel in a really difficult position. Saudi Arabia doesn't want anything to do with the Abraham Accords as long as the Palestinian issue isn't settled. Yes, so where does Israel go from there?
Thank you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, so in terms of the internal divide within Israel, those that see Israel want to see Israel as a liberal democratic state, want to see the Palestinian issue resolved on the basis of a of a two-state solution, even if they think, and many of them do think, it's not possible to do it immediately or quickly or very easily. At least in principle, that's what they want. And obviously, on the other side of the camp that's currently in power in Israel, liberal democratic values are less significant or not significant at all. And what's important is their version of what's authentically Jewish, which includes controlling all of the land of Israel, and only Jews having national rights there. Now, the presence of that version of Israeli identity being in power in Israel, in terms of both its attitude towards the Palestinians, but also its attitude towards democracy in Israel, is, as I mentioned, causing a tension with Western liberal democratic allies. With respect to Iran, Iran seeks legitimacy in the region by claiming that it defends and stands up for the Palestinians, and also tries to seek legitimacy by saying that it represents the authentic values and interests of the whole Islamic world. And Iran is just one Muslim state that seeks leadership and influence in the Islamic world by claiming to represent and stand for and defend Islam as a whole. And we could think of other examples of states like that. Saudi Arabia is shifting in a transition right now, where Islam is becoming less important to its identity and legitimacy. It used to be absolutely central, but now it's also seeking legitimacy in the West, not by building synagogues, though it has its own coexistence projects, which are comparable to those of the UAE. But what is it doing? It's buying, like Qatar, buying golf tournaments and that kind of thing. So it's trying to catch up with the Emiratis in seeking legitimacy in the West through cultural projects, whether it's getting involved in sports and that kind of thing. So we see a recent normalization or a restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but nonetheless, I think quite different strategies from those states in terms of how they secure legitimacy and in terms of the kind of relations they build, in particular with the West.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, hi. Would you like to expand a little on your previous comment about Ukraine and Putin and how this sits with what you've been talking about?
So we see it. This is sort of a personal view. We see a divide. Well, we saw Netanyahu before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but after the annexation of Crimea, continuing to preserve and promote very warm personal relations with Putin. Now, there are good strategic reasons for that. Israel has a very delicate situation in Syria where the Russian Air Force are present and the Russian military, and Russia has air defenses covering Syria, and Israeli aircraft go into Syrian airspace to target Iranians on a regular basis. And it needs to keep a close cooperation or coordination with Russia on that issue. So it's a genuinely very delicate issue. There's also a concern for Jewish communities in Russia. And so there's a delicate, how do we handle our relations with Putin? At the same time, of course, Israel, the US is Israel's most important ally. It has a very close relationship with NATO and a deep kind of long-standing identity as being part of the kind of Western strategic alliance. And of course, utterly dependent on the US in so many respects. So there's a bit of a tension in Israeli policy with respect to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. How far to align with the Western, that's really US and EU-led front, isolating and putting sanctions on Russia and supporting Ukraine with weapons and whatever, and how far to go along with that without sort of upsetting Russia. I see a gap, or a bit of a gap between where Netanyahu is and where the former Prime Minister Lapid is, as an example. I think Netanyahu is more willing to upset the West and less. And I think for the reason that I think he doesn't have a sense of, he doesn't really value Western liberal internationalism, and think it's, and a Western international liberal order as a set of values is not significant for him. I think that Lapid was more willing to upset Russia. Lapid openly condemned Russia. Netanyahu has never done that. And I think that reflects the fact that his identity and his worldview positions him more in line with an international liberal leaders and an international liberal order, and he sees Israel more firmly aligned in that camp, and therefore was more willing to risk upsetting Russia and more willing to openly condemn Russia. And I suspect had he and his government remained in power, would have shown more support for Ukraine than the current Israeli government is doing. And there's actually just in the last couple of days, an absolute blast from the Ukrainian ambassador in Israel on Facebook. Unusually, I mean, you know, the Ukrainians know how to kind of criticize in public to get what they want, but this was a really full-on attack on Israel for its great disappointment about the lack of support, promises that have been made that have not been delivered, things that Israel could help Ukraine with that it's not done so. My view, there is obviously where we have different strategic approaches to how to balance these delicate relationships, but I think there's also this identity divide between who we are as a country. Are we a liberal democratic country? How important is that for us? I think also explains, for me, this gap between different Israeli leaders.
Thank you. And finally, Victor.
Thanks, Judy. Toby, fascinating. And as I try to follow what you were saying, I think that you were moving away from what I would have assumed was the link between Israel and the West being a liberal democracy, or a democracy, as I think one of the ladies was saying earlier on, to moving to, at least at the moment, to saying that there's almost like a religious and cultural link between Israel and some of the Arab countries, but also the right-wing countries in Europe and America with Trump. And as there seems to be this move towards conservatism, that isn't a bad idea or a bad position for Israel. But I was also thinking the real opportunity for Israel is to be both the religious and cultural link, but also the liberal democracy link, like Lapid is trying to do, and Gantz, etc. Then I thought about my elephant in the room, and that is the progressives in the US, because they seem to regard, and I hope this isn't off topic, they seem to regard Israel as being white, therefore oppressors, therefore they don't want to have Israel. And they don't want to allow Israel to have self-determination, although for everybody else, self-determination is a good thing. So I guess I have two questions, if I may. The first one is if that analysis is right, what is the hope for Israel to itself be allowed to have self-determination against the progressives? And secondly, if the huge sticking block or problem area is Palestine, even if Israel wanted a two-state solution, my understanding is that as we speak today, the young Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. They want this from the river to the sea solution. So even if Israel is prepared to compromise, which at the moment it isn't, but if it was to keep the Israeli identity and state together, the Arabs won't. So I'd be interested also, if all of this is right, what your thoughts are about the future of the two-state solution.
No, I think you put your finger on a lot of the points there, and let me sort of just try and just to underline. I think the point is, in Israel we have a divide about its own cultural identity between a kind of liberal democratic version and a more conservative nationalist or religious version. And for those like Netanyahu and his current coalition partners that are in that kind of latter version, the rise of conservatism or populist nationalism in the West is an asset and an ally in terms of resisting pressure from progressives like the Democrats in the US and another, Labour Party in the UK or other centrist or liberal or centre-left or left parties in other parts of the West. So, it depends. So, what I was trying to say at the end, I think was close to what you're saying, which is Israel should preserve its flexibility in this sense, right? If it preserves its liberal democratic character, it can get along fine with the liberal centrist mainstream in Europe and in the United States, but without losing necessarily the support of the conservative nationalists if they're in power, who in any case seek good relations with Israel for their own strategic interests or in terms of gaining legitimacy domestically. So Israel can have the flexibility, but if Israel goes down an illiberal route both with respect to the Palestinians, the occupation kind of becoming permanent, and in terms of eroding its own democratic and liberal democratic institutions internally, then it loses that flexibility. It's losing the bipartisan support in the United States, something that Pid was referring to in the quotation that I mentioned, and that's a threat. That's a major risk for Israel. Now, the second part of your question is, so what about the Palestinian issue? What if Israel, with the best will in the world, can't resolve the Palestinian issue, right? And can't, bring about Palestinian self-determination? Can it win back support among progressives, whether it's in the United States or in Europe? So I think that there are many good reasons why Western states want to have good, close relations with Israel. Israel is a real strategic asset on a lot of levels, particularly in a very unstable region. Israel Israel is an important supporter to military and strategic support to other pro-Western states in the region, and can be a real prop of stability, and is a source of intelligence and cutting-edge military equipment, and a good economic partner. There are plenty of reasons why Western states, including the UK, want to have good relations with Israel. I think if Israel were to do some basic things about reaffirming its commitment to a two-state solution, about acting in a way that is consistent with achieving a future two-state solution, so not building in settlements that are in areas that would be part of a future Palestinian state, for example, outlining its own vision for a two-state solution. Even if it doesn't have a coherent Palestinian partner at the moment, the Palestinians are divided and all the problems on the Palestinian side, if Israel were to act in a coherent and consistent way in line with a two-state solution, I think that would greatly reduce the challenge of, let's say, anti-Zionists on the progressive left, both in the United States and in Europe. They would still exist, but I think they would be much less effective or resonant or threatening to Israel, and would help shore up significantly Israel's support with the mainstream, centrist mainstream, liberal camp, both center-left and center-right, across the West. So I think, the barrier is not, we must get to a two-state solution. I think a consistent policy in line with it, steps towards it that were consistent and coherent, would help considerably.
Thank you, Toby. I apologise for letting it go over time, but I thought that you would all want to ask your questions and hear Toby answer them, which you did so succinctly. So thank you for answering them succinctly so we could have more questions. It was really appreciated. And I thought the whole presentation was so professional and exactly what I had been told to expect from you. So thank you. And again, thank you for bringing this series from Bar Ilan to a close. Thank you, Max, for your support throughout the whole series. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Again, if you want to listen to it again, please let me know and you can have a copy of the recording, because that's part of the reason I do record it. And Toby, yes, please do come back again. And if you're in the UK, let me know if you're coming. And if not, let's do something else online. So thank you, and everyone have a good summer, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for coming.